space shuttle. After 3 days in orbit, it glides in for a landing on a dry lake bed in California. Other rocket planes had landed there before. One of them was the X-15, a small, black, rocket-powered, bullet-shaped airplane. 19 years before Space Shuttle, the X-15 routinely flew into and out of space. What was learned with the X-15 helped make the shuttle a success. There had never been anything like the X-15. It had a 1 million horsepower engine and could fly twice as fast as a rifle bullet. The X-15 set records that stood for years. B-52s launched the X-15 so that test pilots could fly the research flights that would lead to Space Shuttle. But the plane and the men who flew it have been overshadowed by the astronauts and the ballistic missiles that shot them into space like so many human cannonballs. These men flew into space. Without the pilots and the plane and the research program, Space Shuttle would not have gotten off the ground. Charles Lindbergh, the Lone Eagle, the first man to fly across the Atlantic. Lindbergh flew the Spirit of St. Louis at just over 100 miles per hour. His achievement was not speed, but daring. For that, he was admired. Speed thrilled people. By the middle 1930s, the national air races were attracting huge crowds. People who wanted to watch tiny planes go faster and faster. A new speed record was set every year. By today's standards, those speeds were laughably slow. But by their standards, the speeds were breakneck, the pilots daredevils. By trying to go faster, those pilots were showing the way to outer space. They didn't know that, but some of them died for it. Many more would die during World War II. Some of them would die on the ground, taken by surprise. Others would die in the air, but the faster you went, the safer you were. Lessons learned by those daredevil pilots of the 30s paid off for the combat pilots of the 40s. Aircraft speeds doubled. But faster planes are harder to control. More young pilots died not knowing that by going faster, they too were taking us towards space at a price. Science and technology responded to the demands of war with new machines and new weapons. And in the air, better performance and more speed. Always more speed. As combat pilots used that new speed, they ran into a new and mysterious problem. Some combat aircraft simply disintegrated in the air, untouched by enemy fire. Now retired Air Force General Charles E. Yeager was a combat ace. He shot down 13 German planes, and he encountered that mysterious problem.
during dogfights with the Mustang, we'd end up, say, at 35,000 feet or higher, and you'd jump a 109 or 190, and if you got into a tactical advantage, they'd always split S and head for the deck wide open, and you'd be chasing them in the P-51, and the maximum speed of a P-51 going straight down wide open is about 80% of the speed of sound. But in these dives, the controls get a little unruly. You'd have turbulent air and buffeting, and that's the first exposure I had to the effects of Mach on an airplane.
Mach, the speed of sound. In the thick air at sea level, it's 760 miles per hour. In the thin air at 35,000 feet, it's 660 miles per hour. But the effect on the plane is constant. As it goes faster, it pushes air in front of it, building waves of pressure, which at the speed of sound become an invisible wall. By the end of World War II, no plane had broken through that wall. Our propeller-driven planes could not go faster than the speed of sound, so planes that had helped to win the war became expensive junk. Even before the war ended, a program started to develop an airplane that could break the sound barrier. The project was headed by Walt Williams of the National Advisory Committee on Aeronautics.
We had the world's largest air force, but on the other hand, it was totally obsolete. So we went through a period, a little before the war ended, to develop a new air force that could fly quite well, efficiently, near and above the speed of sound.
Designers started with the sleek shape of a .50 caliber bullet. On that form, Bell Aircraft built a rocket-powered plane. The work started in March 1945, and less than 2 years later, there was a plane, the X-1. It was the first of a series of rocket-powered aircraft that would take man faster and higher and lead step by step to space shuttle. The steps into space started at what is now Edwards Air Force Base. It was a flight test center located on the high plateau of the Mojave Desert in California, not far from Death Valley. It was isolated and enormous and had the dry lake beds that are nature's perfect runways. The X-1 landed there after its first powered test flight in late 1946. The Bell Aircraft test pilot was Chalmers Goodland, handsome, dashing, and nicknamed Slick at a time when that was a compliment. But in an age before astronauts had agents, Walt Williams says Slick priced himself out of the program. He'd take the risks, but he wanted to be paid to do it. One report says he asked for $150,000, a fortune in the mid-40s. Air Force Captain Chuck Yeager volunteered. He'd take the risks for regular pay, $3,396 a year, $283 a month to put his life on the line attacking the sound barrier. Britain's top test pilot, Geoffrey de Havilland, had died the year before in a similar attempt. His plane disintegrated.
With the X-1, it had been predicted that it would disintegrate too, but I had a feeling for the X-1. Of course, it was a piece of machinery, but that's, you develop a feeling for machinery and a sort of a passion for an airplane when you fly it, and you have to have a great deal of confidence in it. And I figured that the X-1, knowing it like I did, wouldn't bite me or swap ends on me without giving me some sort of warning.
A B-29 carried the X-1 aloft so that Yeager could try to pass Mach 1. He had already come close. When the B-29 reached 20,000 feet, it would drop Yeager in the X-1 to try again. But 2 days earlier, Yeager had fallen from a horse and broken 2 ribs. They hurt and would hurt worse in the turbulence approaching Mach 1. Yeager told no one, afraid he would be grounded, and he wanted to be in the X-1.
We were up about 9.6 Mach number, and our Mach meter only went to 1.0. I don't think they had a hell of a lot of confidence in us those days. We were in quite a bit of buffeting, and the airplane just shook. And then all at once, the Mach meter just jumped plumb off the scale. And at this point, all the buffeting quit, and the airplane just smoothed out, just as slick as glass. And then I just went ahead and shut the 3 chambers off and let the airplane decelerate back into the buffeting.
I called in within 15 minutes, 30 minutes of the flight. Once we knew, had seen enough to know that we had done it. And about 2 hours later, I got a call from the deputy director of NACA telling me that the program was now classified top secret.
Yeager had taken the X-1 to 43,000 feet and 700 miles an hour, just past Mach 1, the speed of sound. It was, by any standard, an heroic achievement. But this was the only parade Yeager got, pulled around on a desert runway by a dusty Jeep. There was no ticker-tape parade, no visit to the White House, no headlines, no public adoration. Like Lindbergh, Yeager had helped to change the world. But Lindbergh's accomplishment was public. Yeager's was classified. Those were the days of the Cold War, and this tentative step towards space had to be kept top secret. It was only one step. We would need so many more. Above the Mojave Desert, the Edwards test pilots pushed themselves and their new planes to the edge. If it happened in aviation in the early 50s, it happened at Edwards. That attracted 29-year-old Scott Crossfield, a civilian graduate engineer with a master's degree in aeronautics. Within a year, he would build a reputation as one of the best, a rival to Chuck Yeager. Crossfield did not fit the Hollywood image of a test pilot, but he was cocky, he was independent, and he wanted to be part of the rocket plane program. In 1980, 60 years old, Crossfield went back to Edwards. South Base is deserted now. When Crossfield first got there, it was the center of the test pilot's universe.
This was really the place to be. There was no question about it at all. I was awestruck. When Walt Williams showed me the airplanes they had, there was no question in my mind where I belonged. Howard Hughes can't fly those airplanes, you know.
Despite the popular imagination, test pilots were not wild and reckless. They were methodical, careful, intent on testing planes step by step. The object was to find out what the new jets and rockets could do and stay alive to report it. A lot of them didn't.
Killed 17 people on this base in 2 years. You just learn to hypnotize yourself into putting it out of your mind. If you're given to reacting to fear, you've got no business being a test pilot. And if you refuse to acknowledge, at least to yourself, fear, you've got no business being a test pilot.
The word fear, you really don't consider it as a part of your vocabulary when you're testing airplanes, because we call it apprehension. Number one, when you're involved in programs where the outcome is questionable, and when your neck's on the line, it really, you don't look at it as being dangerous. It's something that you're sort of dedicated to, and you just sort of concede the fact that that's your job and that's what you're going to do. And you don't really think about the outcome. And of course, a lot of pilots got killed.
The public saw this kind of high-performance flying only at air shows. For the test pilots at Edwards, it was daily routine. Dangerous, but routine. The goal was research. Find out what each plane could do, what its limits were, and put it into a bland engineering report. On the other hand, no one said setting a record was all bad. Going higher, going faster, doing something today that no one could do yesterday, that's the way the test pilots kept score. In 3 years, Crossfield put in more hours in the experimental rocket planes than any other pilot. And if he was the calm professional in the air, he was not above showing off on the ground. Modest people are seldom, if ever, test pilots. But they are cautious, and if showing off was called for, the ground was the place to do it. It's safe there, or it's supposed to be.
I had made many dead-stick landings with the rocket airplanes on the lake bed, and had perfected a technique where I could land where I wanted, and then I would coast up the ramp and tap the brakes and park the airplane in front of the hangar, dead stick, and that was just a little flourish.
Scott's a pretty good pilot, but he, like all of us test pilots who were flying so many different kinds of airplanes in those days, didn't pay an awful lot of attention to the emergency systems. And what happened, he landed on a lake bed and brought the airplane up onto the ramp and was going to stop it in front of the hangar, but had no brakes, so it went right on through the hangar and the nose stuck right through the wall.
And subsequently, every time he had a chance in public, Yeager would always say the sonic wall was his, the hangar wall was Crossfield's.
There was a rivalry between Crossfield and Yeager. It was most obvious in November 1953, 1 month short of the 50th anniversary of the Wright brothers' first flight. The Air Force wanted to use the X-1A to celebrate. Yeager had taken the X-1 past the speed of sound, and the Air Force wanted him to take the X-1A to twice the speed of sound. The plane was designed to fly that fast, and Yeager decided to try. Crossfield wanted to get there first. He talked the Navy into letting him try for Mach 2 in the Douglas skyrocket. It was not designed for that speed. But whoever reached Mach 2 would be the fastest man alive, if he survived. Crossfield tried first. He and his crew did everything they could think of to make the aging skyrocket faster than it ought to be.
We cold-soaked that thing and wiped off every fly speck. There wasn't any excess drag on it at all. And we started loading it, 6 or 8 hours earlier than we would, and let that liquid oxygen just soak it till it was so damn cold you couldn't touch it. Your hand would freeze on it anywhere. Good cold morning, miserable morning. I had the flu, the weather was bad.
Crossfield tried and failed 6 times. In late November 1953, he made his 7th and final attempt to reach Mach 2. He either did it this time or let Yeager try. Being second was not Crossfield's style. He would use all his skill and knowledge to take the skyrocket to twice the speed of sound, even if it wasn't supposed to fly that fast. Crossfield fired all 4 rockets and started to climb. He easily passed Mach 1 and kept going. At 72,000 feet, Crossfield put the rocket plane into a dive and hit Mach 2.
It was there, you know. It was something you wanted to do, wanted to be first to do. Particularly if I could needle Jaeger about it. That was it.
At Edwards Air Force Base, Muroc, California, test pilot Scott Crossfield and the needle-nosed Douglas skyrocket. Now, 32-year-old scientist pilot Scott Crossfield, first man to fly twice the speed of sound.
22 days later, Chuck Yeager got his shot at the title, fastest man alive. Crossfield had gone 1,291 miles per hour, Mach 2.005. Yeager wanted to go faster. He did, Mach 2.42. It almost killed him.
As we went through 2.3 Mach number, the airplane began to yaw. Then the outside wing started coming up, and nothing was causing the airplane to respond. And the airplane rolled over, went inverted, and then pitched up. At this point, the canopy busted. And I didn't know, really, I couldn't orient myself to up and down. And the X-1A, we had no way of getting out of it either. No ejection seat, so, of course, I blacked out.
With Yeager blacked out, the X-1A fell 51,000 feet in 51 seconds. The plane spun and tumbled. Yeager was simultaneously pushed, pulled, and slammed around. His helmet cracked the canopy. He came to disoriented, weak, and bleeding. The X-1A was in a deadly end-over-end tumble, an inverted spin. It is usually fatal.
So I just sort of hung on in this inverted spin. I recovered from that into normal spin and popped it out of the normal spin at about 25,000 feet and looked around, found the lake bed, and glided on in and landed.
Yeager had beaten the sound barrier only to find a second barrier. Engineers called it high-speed instability, a loss of all control at 1,500 miles per hour. Yeager regained control. Crossfield knew why.
It's Yeager's total skill that allowed him to recover the airplane so that we had one to go another day. He was probably fortunate that Yeager was a pilot on that flight.
Chuck Yeager was away when the X-2 finally arrived at Edwards 5 years behind schedule. It had been built to fly 3 times the speed of sound, Mach 3, and theoretically it could. Theoretically. September 27th, 1956. Air Force Captain Milburn Apt tries for a record in the X-2. He wants the rocket plane to do what it was designed to do. Fly at 3 times the speed of sound. Captain Apt died, a victim of that neutral engineering phrase, high-speed instability. From the pieces of the X-2, engineers learned that the tail had to be larger. And until it was, no one was going to survive Mach 3. There was a rocket plane that might make it, that might get past not only high-speed instability, but the Earth's atmosphere as well. A plane that might fly into space. But it wasn't ready. So everyone waited for the X-15. The planning had started years before. The X-15 was not another rocket-powered aircraft. It was to be the first rocket-powered spacecraft. The Wright brothers took us into the air. The X-15 was to take us beyond it. Using a 1,000,000-horsepower rocket engine, the X-15 was designed to break away from Earth's gravity and fly into space. It would not orbit. It would go into space and back in controlled flight. The X-15 was being built by North American Aviation, and one of the men working on it was Scott Crossfield. He had left Edwards and joined the private contractor. He wanted to help with the design, fly the builder's tests, and persuade the government to let him take it into space. Crossfield was betting his career that he could do it. Crossfield's boss at North American was the X-15 project coordinator, an engineer named Harrison Storms. Storms knew exactly what he wanted the X-15 to be.
It was the most advanced aircraft in the world. In fact, it still is the most advanced aircraft in the world as far as that goes, even today.
Storms wasn't building the X-15 so that Crossfield or anyone else could fly fast in the clear Mojave sky. He was looking beyond the sky.
One of the most powerful reasons for wanting to do a project like the X-15 is it's one of the primary steps on your way to space, and it's a necessary step.
But there was another way to space. Scientists were working with ballistic missiles. You couldn't fly them, and in the 50s, as often as not, you couldn't launch them either. At Cape Canaveral, missiles were an exotic, expensive, often explosive scientific sideshow. It didn't matter until the fall of 1957. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik 1. It orbited the Earth, its steady beep a constant reminder that we had been beaten.
It was just at dusk, and I looked up, and there was Sputnik. To see that moving across the sky, which was just a point of light, was really an awesome feeling. There was something that I couldn't touch, I couldn't get to, I couldn't do anything about it. I felt a degree of frustration, resentment.
Chagrin, shock, downright embarrassing. We didn't like it worth a damn, professionally.
6, 5, 4.
63 days after the first beep from Sputnik, the United States had a Vanguard missile ready to launch from Cape Canaveral. It would put us back into the space race. There was live national television coverage. At North American, the X-15 program had its own problems. The rocket plane was on schedule, the rocket engine was not. One of the earlier decisions of the newly formed Space Administration was that ballistic missiles, not winged craft, would be the fastest, least expensive way to put men into space. Attention shifted from Edwards to Canaveral. The test pilots at Edwards said that no one would fly these things, they'd ride them. There would be no pilots, only passengers. September 1959. The first test of the X-15 under power. Flying, not gliding. The fuel is liquid oxygen and alcohol, so explosive that the X-15 is actually an 18,000-pound bomb. Should it blow, Crossfield, the X-15, the B-52, and its four-man crew would simply disappear. Crossfield had made the B-52 pilot agree that if there is trouble, the pilot will dump the X-15 and save the B-52. That is not heroics, but mathematics. Better to lose one man than 5. For this test, Joe Walker of NASA would fly one of the chase planes, and Air Force Major Bob White the other. Both were waiting to take the X-15 into space when North American turned it over to the government.
Hello, Chase 1, 2, and 3, 003 is taxi.
Crossfield wanted to fly the X-15 to space, but the government didn't want him there. His orders were specific: low and slow, below 60,000 feet, below Mach 2.
Chase 2, tower, cleared for takeoff when ready.
Crossfield could obey his orders only if there was a launch, if the rocket engines fired, if they did not blow up, if the X-15 flew, if no one made a mistake, if the engineers were right, if.
20 seconds. Launch light is on. Got her on 15 seconds. Let's prime look. Looks good, it's blossomed. 7 seconds. 5, count down, Scott. 4, 3, 2, 1, release.
It worked. The X-15's first powered flight was perfect, and to stay low and slow, Crossfield had to hold it back. The X-15 went nowhere near its limits. To celebrate, Crossfield allowed himself one unauthorized barrel roll. Nothing went wrong. The first powered flight was perfect. So was the second. The third started as well, then went wrong. One of the engines caught fire.
We got a fire, Scott, like shutdown.
Crossfield and his chase pilots were calm. No one mentioned the obvious. The X-15 could explode.
How much fire have I got? Back by the rear of the engine. Prime off. Going to jettison. Am I jettisoning? You're jettisoning. Roger. I'm going to land on Rosamond. I still have a fire warning light. Jettison is still full blast. Only when I hit the center of Rosamond, I'm going to make roughly a 360. Stand by that fire truck over there, QC. Okay, I think you can turn now, Scott. Roger.
Coming in nose down, Crossfield could not jettison the fuel. He was heavy, too heavy.
Okay, you can, don't forget to arm your ventral. Ventral coming off now. It's off and the ventral is on. Roger, it's on the flaps.
The X-15 touched down and broke.
What's happening? Bill, this is QC. Do you read Scott at all?
The X-15 split inches behind the cockpit, inches ahead of the fuel tanks. Move the split either way, and Crossfield might not have walked away.
There was a design oversight in the nose gear, and that's what caused it to break in two. In fact, it probably should have broken on the first landing that I ever made with the airplane because the deficiency was there.
That deficiency was corrected, and of the next 16 launches, 13 were successful.
Good, Joe. You're on your way.
North Americans' X-15 tests ended. The governments began. Joe Walker of NASA flew the X-15, and Crossfield flew chase in a conventional jet, their roles reversed. The X-15 was flawless. Competitive instincts came back. Be first. Be fastest. Go highest. Head for space. Maybe the X-15 could beat the Russians. Perhaps even beat the Mercury astronauts. Spring 1960. 1.5 years after the X-15 was rolled out, the 1 million horsepower engine arrives at Edwards. Someone has to test it. Someone who knows what he's doing. Scott Crossfield would make the engine do everything it would have to do to carry the X-15 to space. The X-15 was locked in steel grips. Crossfield wouldn't fly 1 foot, but he would be as alone as if he were in the air.
On this sequence,
Those who designed and built the engine were confident it would work,
call it off time-wise. I can call it because I won't be able to hear you when you...
but it might explode, and 1 million horsepower would make a big bang.
Okay, you into the pillboxes and close the doors. Art, will you make sure everybody is clear and then come in yourself? Right. Ed, would you give us a short blast on the siren? Right.
It is axiomatic in testing. Never risk more people than you must.
We are secure.
To test the engine, the only man who had to be risked was Crossfield.
Biggest bang I'd ever heard. It was like being in the sun, and the cockpit and instrument bay was blown about 30 or 40 feet from its original position, and the fire was burning all around. And while I, of course, was concerned, I realized that I was in a structure in the cockpit that was designed to resist heat.
What Crossfield survived was a force 50 times the pull of gravity. He survived because the cockpit had been designed to protect the pilot from that force, and worse. Crossfield had helped design it. And the engine design was good. The explosion was caused by a faulty valve. But the blast was spectacular and attracted attention.
The newspaper started calling, and I tried to calm them down, and I told them to relax. The only damage was the press in my pants. And sure enough, the next morning, an East Coast newspaper had a headline, X-15 blows up, pilot wets pants.
November 1960. Scott Crossfield flew a complete X-15, million horsepower engine and all. It had 3 times the power of a Vanguard missile and burned a ton of fuel in 11 seconds. Crossfield finally was in a spacecraft. It could climb out of the Earth's atmosphere at 6 times the speed of sound.
It was a culmination of many years. That was the flight we'd worked for from the day we first conceived the X-15, and all of the pieces were in place.
In 1961, NASA and military pilots started toward space in careful, calculated, controlled steps. 14 years earlier, Chuck Yeager had first flown at the speed of sound. Now, that was slow. Only one flight in 1961 was below Mach 2. Faster and faster toward space. By the end of the year, Major Bob White would take the X-15 above 200,000 feet and would go faster than 4,000 miles per hour, above Mach 6. successes were overshadowed before they were achieved. Colonel Yuri Gagarin of the Soviet Union not only went into space, his capsule made a single orbit around the Earth, putting the United States behind again. The X-15 could not match Gagarin's achievement, nor could the ballistic missiles. A month later, Mercury astronaut Alan Shepard made a suborbital flight. A missile shot him 116 miles up, 302 miles downrange. It won a commitment from the president.
I believe that this nation should commit itself to achieving the goal before this decade is out of landing a man on the moon and returning him safely to the Earth.
Missile stole the show. The public imagination was captured by the thundering, fiery precision of them. Broadcast live. It was the show of the decade. Mercury, Gemini, Apollo, success on success. July 17th, 1962. Major White flies the X-15 into space and flies back. Only a few people notice. In the next 5 years, 7 X-15 pilots will routinely fly into space, do research for the Gemini and Apollo programs, and fly back. The X-15 was the space program's workhorse. The ballistic missile was the thoroughbred, racing for the moon. October 1967. Pete Knight is given a new research project. The job will make him the fastest man alive or kill him. Knight is to test the effect of high-speed aerodynamic heating. The X-15 is fitted with extra fuel tanks and sprayed with a heat-resistant coating. Knight's job is to push the X-15 to 4,000 miles per hour. Scientists know the airstream will create enormous heat. They don't know precisely what that heat will do. Knight reached more than 4,500 miles per hour.
And as we did that, we burned off the lower ventral, we burnt the ramjet off. The temperatures were getting so high and we were burning things out faster than I could have probably taken care of. And if I had known it was the last flight, rather than stopping at 6.7, I think I would have been tempted to go to Mach 7 at least, just to get one more Mach number. But I think if we had, we would have probably lost the aircraft.
The protective coating failed, but during the test, Knight reached 4,520 miles per hour, a record. Knight's record would stand until the space shuttle. In the 1981 World Almanac and Book of Facts, Knight's name is not mentioned, not at all. From the time of Greek mythology, men have dreamed of flying, of commanding the sky. Only recently have they dreamed of commanding space, of flying there. And they have. 34 years after Slick Goodland landed the X-1 on the dry lake bed at Edwards, the space shuttle landed there. The X-1 led to the X-15, the X-15 to the shuttle. And the shuttle could make space as useful as the Wright brothers had made the sky useful. So much has happened in our lifetime. We forget too easily and too quickly. It was only 78 years ago that an automobile made the first trip from coast to coast. It took 71 days. Now it takes 5 days round trip to the moon. We celebrate what we have done. We forget who did it. We keep the machines. We discard the people. In today's world of high-speed change, how long would Charles Lindbergh have held our imagination? We expect success. We assume technology will make it possible. Advanced machines eclipse the men who control them. Did Chuck Yeager break the sound barrier, or did the X-1? Do we look up to the man or the machine? Before these machines led us to space, we lived in a time we could more easily understand, even share. We could imagine being in the sky with Lindbergh. We might even have been able to do what he did. Maybe. No more. Perhaps what has happened in our lifetime will be seen more clearly in the future. Machines took us into space. They would not have, had not man conceived them, designed them, built them, and flown them. Most importantly, no machine would have been in space had not some person dreamed of going there. Machines do. Men dream.